Today's discussion is going to be on Chapter 13, the brain and cranial nerves. The brain is composed of four major regions: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, divided into left and right cerebral hemispheres. Each hemisphere is further divided into 5 functional areas known as lobes. It is responsible for higher brain functions such as cognition, sensory perception, voluntary movement, and language. The diencephalon is broken into 3 different components: the epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. The epithalamus is involved in regulating sleep-wake cycles and producing melatonin. The thalamus acts as a relay station for sensory information and plays a role in consciousness and alertness. The hypothalamus regulates homeostasis, hormone production, hunger, thirst, and the autonomic nervous system. The brainstem is broken down into the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain processes visual and auditory information, controls eye movement, and regulates involuntary motor response. The pons acts as a bridge connecting different parts of the brain and regulates breathing. And the medulla oblongata controls vital functions such as heart rate, breathing, swallowing, and reflexes like coughing and vomiting. The cerebellum is situated inferior to the cerebrum, behind the brainstem. Its function is to coordinate voluntary movements, maintain posture and balance, and plays a role in learning and cognitive functions. Some of the structural features include the gyri, which are folds of the outer brain tissue that are formed by folding of the cerebral cortex to increase surface area. The sulci are shallow depressions between gyri. Fissures are deeper grooves dividing the brain into major regions. Neurulation is like the blueprint phase for building the nervous system in a developing embryo. Imagine a house being constructed from scratch, but in this case, it's the nervous system of a growing baby inside the mother's womb. In the early stages, when the baby is just a tiny ball of cells, also known as an embryo, one part starts to bulge out and form a tube-like structure called the neural tube. Think of it like the foundation of the nervous system. The neural tube then starts to fold and close like a long, skinny balloon getting pinched in the middle. As it closes, it forms the basis for the brain and spinal cord. Once the neural tube is formed, it begins to develop into different parts of the nervous system. At one end, it becomes the brain, and at the other end, it becomes the spinal cord. As the neural tube continues to grow and develop, it gives rise to all the different parts of the nervous system, including the brain, spinal cord, and nerves that spread throughout the body. There are 2 distinct tissue areas present within the brain and spinal cord: the gray and white matter. Gray matter gets its color from the cell bodies and dendrites of neurons. It is found in areas like the cortex, which is the superficial layer, the nuclei, which are the deeper clusters. This is the site of information processing, including decision-making and sensory perception. White matter gets its color from bundles of myelinated axons. Bundles are also called tracts and transmit nerve signals between regions of the body. It acts as the communication network of the nervous system, facilitating rapid transmission of information. Functionality includes gray matter is where processing information occurs, and white matter relays nerve signals between brain regions. Meninges are protective connective tissue membranes surrounding and partitioning portions of the brain. It serves as a barrier against trauma and infection. Cerebrospinal fluid acts as a cushioning fluid between specific layers of meninges and helps to maintain a stable environment around the brain and spinal cord. The blood-brain barrier is a unique barrier in the brain preventing harmful substances from entering from the blood. This helps to maintain the brain's internal environment and protects it from toxins and pathogens. The cranial meninges are broken into 3 different layers. The pia mater is the innermost layer, closely adhering to the surface of the brain and spinal cord. It provides support and protection to delicate neural tissue. The arachnoid mater is the middle layer located between the pia mater and the dura mater and forms a barrier and helps to regulate the flow of cerebrospinal fluid. The dura mater is the outermost and toughest layer, forming a durable protective barrier. It supports and separates the brain from the bones of the cranium and contains and protects blood vessels that supply the brain. Again, the pia mater is the innermost of the cranial meninges. It is composed of a thin layer of delicate areolar connective tissue and is tightly adhered to the brain, following all the contours closely. Its function is to provide support and protection to the brain, covers and supports small blood vessels entering the brain, and assists in the formation of cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricles. The arachnoid mater is also known as the arachnoid membrane. It lies external to the pia mater. It is partially composed of a delicate web of collagen and elastic fibers termed the arachnoid trabeculae. The subarachnoid space is located immediately deep to the arachnoid mater containing cerebrospinal fluid. It functions to support cerebral arteries and veins within the subarachnoid space. The dura mater is the strongest of the meninges. It is the outermost layer, composed of dense irregular connective tissue consisting of 2 layers. You have the meningeal layer, which is immediately superficial to the arachnoid, and the periosteal layer, which is the more superficial layer and forms the periosteum of the internal surfaces of the cranial bones. The meningeal layer is usually fused to the periosteal layer, except in specific areas where they are separate. In areas where the 2 layers are separate, they form large, blood-filled spaces called dural venous sinuses. Dural venous sinuses drain blood from the brain. There are 2 potential spaces associated with dura mater, the epidural space and the subdural space. The epidural space is located between the dura mater and the bones of the skull and contains arteries and veins that nourish the meninges and bones of the cranium. The subdural space is positioned between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater. Brain ventricles are derived from the neural canal, which is the lumen of the embryonic neural tube. It is covered with ependymal cells and filled with cerebrospinal fluid. It is interconnected with each other and with the central canal. They are interconnected with each other and with the central canal of the spinal cord. There are lateral ventricles that are located within the cerebrum and separated by a thin medial partition. The third ventricle is located in the diencephalon. It is smaller, thinner compared to the lateral ventricles and is connected to each other. It is connected to each lateral ventricle. The fourth ventricle passes through the midbrain and connects the third ventricle. Cerebrospinal fluid is a clear, colorless liquid. It circulates within the ventricles and subarachnoid space. It bathes the exposed surfaces of the central nervous system and surrounds it completely. Its function includes buoyancy, where the brain floats within the cerebrospinal fluid, reducing its apparent weight by over 95%. This prevents the brain from being crushed under its own weight. It also provides protection. Cerebrospinal fluid provides a liquid cushion protecting delicate neural structures from sudden movements. Environmental stability is also a function. It helps to transport nutrients and chemical messengers to the brain. It also removes waste products from the brain and protects the nervous tissue from chemical fluctuations that disrupt neural function. Waste products and excessive cerebrospinal fluid are transported into the veins of the cardiovascular system. Blood is delivered to the brain as part of general circulation. The brain is shielded from the contents of the blood by the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier strictly regulates which substances can enter the interstitial fluid of the brain. It helps in preventing exposure to neurons in the brain, to drugs, waste products in the blood, variations in levels of normal substances such as hormones. It also regulates the passage of substances to maintain a stable environment within the brain. It is formed by specialized capillaries surrounded by astrocytes. While highly selective, the blood-brain barrier is not absolute and allows certain substances to pass through under specific conditions. The cerebrum, also known as the location of conscious thought. The cerebrum houses conscious thought processes and complex intellectual function. It consists of two large hemispheres located on the superior aspect of the brain. It enables activities such as reading and comprehending text, turning pages, forming and retaining ideas, and engaging in discussion with peers. The gray matter components include the cerebral cortex, which is the surface layer of gray matter. It is responsible for higher cognitive functions. The cerebral cortex, also gray matter, is internal and deep to the cerebral cortex. It is involved in various neural processing tasks. Cerebral gray matter serves as centers for integration and processing of information. The cerebrum consists of two halves known as left and right cerebral hemispheres. Within each hemisphere lies the lateral ventricle. They are separated by a longitudinal fissure, a narrow cleft along the mid-sagittal plane. They are paired hemispheres and are mostly separate, except for specific locations where white matter tracts facilitate communication between them. Communication pathways include bundles of axons called tracts, which form white matter regions that connect the hemispheres. The largest of the tracts is known as the corpus callosum and serves as a major pathway for interhemispheric communication, meaning communication between the two hemispheres. This enables coordination and integration of functions between left and right cerebral hemispheres. Each cerebral hemisphere is segmented into 5 distinct lobes. 4 lobes, the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital, are prominently visible on the exterior surface. The 5th lobe, known as the insula, is situated deep within the frontal and temporal lobes. The frontal lobe, which is positioned at the front of the brain, is responsible for functions such as voluntary movement, decision-making, and personality. The parietal lobe, which is located on the top and back, is involved in processing sensory information, spatial awareness, and perception. The temporal lobes, which are found on the sides of the brain, are crucial for auditory processing, memory, and language comprehension. And the occipital lobe, which is situated at the rear of the brain, is primarily dedicated to visual processing and interpretation. The deep lobe, known as the insula, is nestled within the folds of the frontal and temporal lobes and plays roles in emotion, self-awareness, and interoception. Positioned in the frontal lobes, The cortical regions dedicated to motor function govern voluntary movement and muscle control. Nestled within the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe, the primary cortex or somatic motor area orchestrates voluntary skeletal muscle activity. Neurons here execute commands for movement initiation and coordination. The motor speech area, also known as Broca's area, is located in the interolateral portion of the left frontal lobe. This area is responsible for controlling the muscular movements necessary for vocalization. Association areas, known as the primary motor cortical regions, are connected to adjacent association areas that coordinate discrete skeletal muscle movement. The premotor cortex, or somatic motor association area, is located within the frontal lobe immediately anterior to the precentral gyrus and is responsible for coordinating learned, skilled motor activities. An intriguing aspect of the brain organization is the cross-control pattern. The left primary motor cortex directs motor activity to the right side of the body, while the right primary cortex governs movements on the left side of the body. Within the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe lies the primary somatosensory cortex. It is responsible for processing somatic sensory information. It receives input from the skin receptors conveying touch, pressure, pain, and temperature sensations, and integrates them for perception. Wernicke's area is situated predominantly in the left hemisphere. Wernicke's area plays a pivotal role in language comprehension. It facilitates the recognition, understanding, and interpretation of spoken and written language, contributing to fluent communication. Certain cortical areas act as integration hubs, mediating communication between various association areas across different lobes. These regions facilitate the synthesis and processing of complex information from diverse sources. Beyond motor and sensory functions, the cerebral cortex supports higher cognitive processes such as language, memory, and problem solving. The motor and sensory homunculi are fascinating representations of how the brain organizes and perceives sensory and motor functions. The motor homunculus is a topographic map located on the surface of the precentral gyrus, also known as the primary motor cortex, within the frontal lobe. It illustrates the disproportionate representation of different body parts based on the density of motor innervation from the primary cortex. Body parts requiring precise and fine motor control, such as the hands and face, occupy larger cortical areas compared to less dexterous regions like the trunk or lower limbs. This representation reflects the brain's emphasis on motor control and coordination for activities such as grasping, manipulating objects, and facial expressions. The sensory homunculus, in contrast, is a similar topographic map, but located on the surface of the post-central gyrus, or primary somatosensory cortex, within the parietal lobe. It depicts the relative sensitivity and neural representation of different body parts based on their sensory input. Body regions with heightened sensory acuity, such as the lips, fingertips, and hands, are allocated larger cortical areas compared to less sensitive areas like the back and legs. This representation reflects the brain's prioritization of sensory processing for tasks like tactile discrimination, proprioception, and temperature perception. Located deep to the gray matter of the cerebral cortex, forming the core of the cerebrum, is the central white matter. It is composed primarily of myelinated axons, which appear white due to their fatty myelin sheath. Axons are organized into bundles known as tracts. facilitating communication between different regions of the brain. Tracts within the central white matter are classified into three main categories: association tracts, commissural tracts, and projection tracts. Association tracts connect different regions of the cerebral cortex within the same hemisphere. They facilitate communication and integration of information between adjacent or distant areas of the cortex. It plays a crucial role in higher order cognitive functions such as memory, language, and executive control. Commissural tracts extend between cerebral hemispheres, allowing communication and coordination between the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Cross the midline of the brain through specialized structures called commissures, such as the corpus callosum. This enables the integration and sensory information, motor commands, and cognitive processes across both hemispheres. Projection tracts link the cerebral cortex to inferior brain regions, including the brainstem and spinal cord. They carry sensory information from the body to the brain, known as ascending pathways, and motor commands from the brain to the body, known as descending pathways. This is essential for regulating voluntary movements, sensory perception, and autonomic functions such as heart rate and respiration. Again, the association tracts connect different regions of the cerebral cortex within the same hemisphere, facilitating communication and integration of information. Short association tracts consist of arcuate or bowed fibers that connect neighboring gyri or ridges within the same lobe of the cerebral cortex. Long association tracts, such as the longitudinal fasciculi, connect gyri in different lobes of the same hemisphere, allowing for coordinated processing across multiple brain regions. Commissural tracts extend between the cerebral hemispheres through specialized axonal bridges called commissures. The most prominent commissural tract is the corpus callosum, which also allows for communication and coordination between the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Other commissural tracts include the anterior commissure and the hippocampal commissure. Projection tracts are tracts that link the cerebral cortex to the inferior brain regions, including the brainstem and spinal cord. They carry sensory information from the body to the brain, known as ascending pathways, and motor commands from the brain to the body, known as descending pathways. One notable feature of projection tracts is the internal capsule, which is a densely packed group of axons passing between the cerebral nuclei and the gray matter of the thalamus. The internal capsule serves as major conduit for motor and sensory fibers traveling between the cerebral cortex and the brain or spinal cord. Each hemisphere tends to be specialized for certain tasks. Cerebral lateralization refers to the specialization of functions between the left and right hemispheres of the brain. It's like saying each side of the brain has its own special job. The left hemisphere is often associated with logical thinking, language, and analytical tasks. It helps us with things like speaking, reading, and solving math problems. The right hemisphere is the side that is usually linked to creativity, imagination, and understanding emotions. It helps us recognize faces, appreciate art, and interpret music. While both hemispheres work together for most tasks, they also have their own unique strengths. The cerebral nuclei is also known as the basal nuclei or basal ganglia, which are clusters of gray matter located deep within the brain beneath the cerebral cortex and lateral ventricles. Their main role is to regulate and fine-tune motor movements initiated by the cerebral cortex, helping to inhibit unwanted or unnecessary movements. The nuclei consists of components, each serving a specific function. Some of the main components include the caudate nucleus. This component is involved in various functions, including motor control, learning, and memory. lentiform nucleus, which is made up of the putamen, and globus pallidus. It plays a role in motor control and coordination. The claustrum is a thin sheet of gray matter adjacent to the insular cortex. Its precise function is still not fully understood, but it's believed to be involved in sensory integration and consciousness. The amygdaloid body is located near the caudate nucleus. The amygdala is associated with processing of emotions, especially fear, as well as memory formation and decision making. Together, these components of the cerebral nuclei help to coordinate motor functions and contribute to emotional processing, behavioral control, and mood regulation. The diencephalon is also often called the in-between brain. It is a region situated between the lower portions of the cerebral hemispheres. It consists of three main components: the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. Additionally, the third ventricle, which is one of the fluid-filled cavities within the brain, is closely associated with the diencephalon. These components of the diencephalon work together to regulate various physiological processes, maintain homeostasis, and integrate sensory and motor functions within the brain. The epithalamus is positioned at the top of the diencephalon. The epithalamus is involved in regulating sleep-wake cycles and certain endocrine functions. It also contains the pineal gland, which secretes the hormone melatonin, playing a role in the circadian rhythms and sleep patterns. Again, the epithalamus is partially forms the posterior roof of the diencephalon. It covers the third ventricle and contains the pineal gland. The pineal gland secretes the hormone melatonin, which regulates the body's circadian rhythm, also known as day-night cycle. It also influences sleep-wake patterns. It also contains the habenular nuclei, which is where it relays signals from the limbic system to the midbrain. It is involved in visceral and emotional responses to odors. The thalamus serves as a crucial relay center for sensory information traveling to and from the cerebral cortex. It receives sensory signals from various parts of the body, processes them, and then directs them to the appropriate regions of the cerebral cortex for further interpretation. It also plays a role in regulating consciousness, arousal, and attention. The thalamus is composed of paired oval masses of gray matter. It forms the superolateral walls of the third ventricle and functions as a relay point for incoming sensory information. Incoming sensory signals are processed and then projected to the appropriate lobe of the cerebral cortex. It acts as an information filter. Only a small portion of sensory information is forwarded to the cerebrum. It receives sensory nerve signals from all conscious senses except olfaction, synapses in at least one of the nuclei, and is principal for final relay point for incoming sensory information before projection to the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus is positioned below the thalamus. The hypothalamus is a vital regulatory center involved in numerous essential functions, including controlling body temperature, hunger, thirst, and sleep. It also regulates the release of hormones from the pituitary gland, serving as the link between the nervous and endocrine systems. Additionally, the hypothalamus is involved in emotional responses, sexual behavior, and the body's stress response. The hypothalamus is located in the antero-inferior region of the diencephalon and is attached to the pituitary gland. It functions as the master control of autonomic nervous system, the master control of the endocrine system, regulation of body temperature, control of food intake, control of water intake, regulation of sleep-wake rhythms, and control of emotional behavior. The brainstem connects the brain, or the cerebrum, diencephalon, and cerebellum to the spinal cord. It is made up of three parts, from top to bottom: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. It acts as a two-way path for signals between the brain and the spinal cord. It controls vital autonomic functions like breathing and blood pressure, and contains nerve centers for several cranial nerves. It also has the reticular formation, which helps control sleep, alertness, and consciousness. The midbrain is the superior part of the brainstem and includes the cerebral peduncle, which is where motor tracts on the frontal side that send voluntary movement signals from the brain. The pyramidal system sends signals for voluntary movements through the midbrain. Sensory axons carry sensory information from the medulla oblongata through the pons and midbrain to the thalamus. And the substantia nigra, which contains neurons that produce dopamine, a chemical important for controlling movement, emotional responses, and feelings of pleasure and pain. The pons is a bulging section located at the front of the brainstem. It contains sensory and motor pathways that connect the brain and spinal cord. It regulates breathing by working with the medulla's respiratory center. It contains sensory and motor nuclei for the cranial nerves 5, trigeminal, 6, abducens, 7, facial, and part of 8, the vestibular cochlear. The medulla oblongata is the lowest part of the brainstem, connected directly to the spinal cord. All communication between the brain and spinal cord passes through the medulla. Pyramids are the two ridges on the front side that carry motor signals through the corticospinal tracts, also known as pyramidal tracts. Decussation is the point where the motor signals cross over to the opposite side of the brain. It contains autonomic centers for cardiovascular control of heart rate and contraction strength, and medullary respiratory center, which controls breathing rate. It is involved in reflexes like coughing, sneezing, swallowing, and vomiting, and contains cranial nerve nuclei for cranial nerves 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. It controls fine control over skeletal muscle actions and stores memories of movement patterns. The cerebellum is composed of left and right cerebellar hemispheres. Each hemisphere consists of two lobes, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, separated by the primary fissure. Internally partitioned into three regions: the outer gray matter, called the cerebellar cortex, the internal region of white matter, and the deepest gray matter layer composed of cerebellar nuclei. The cerebellum coordinates and refines movements made by skeletal muscles, which are initiated by the cerebrum. It ensures muscle contractions happen in a correct sequence, leading to smooth, coordinated movements. It helps to maintain balance and posture, and receives sensory information from muscles and joints to adjust body position. It also constantly processes information from both sensory and motor pathways in the brain. The brain encompasses two vital functional systems that collaborate for a shared objective. They are referred to as functional brain systems due to their structures being dispersed across multiple regions of the brain. These systems include the limbic system and the reticular formation. The limbic system is comprised of various cerebral and diencephalon structures working together to process and regulate emotions. It is often termed the emotional brain due to its central role in emotional experience and processing. The reticular formation is loosely organized mass of gray matter running vertically through the midbrain, pons, and medulla, extending slightly into the diencephalon and spinal cord. It contains both motor and sensory components. The motor components communicate with the spinal cord and regulate skeletal muscle tone, assisting in reflexive motor functions such as respiration, blood pressure, and heart rate. The sensory component, also known as the reticular activating system, or RAS, is responsible for alerting the cerebrum to incoming sensory information. It processes visual, auditory, and tactile stimuli to maintain mental alertness, and arouses us from sleep when there is little to no stimuli. The RAS is less stimulated, making it easier to sleep. Consciousness is the awareness of sensation, voluntary control of muscle activities, and higher mental processing. It is the highest state of consciousness is alertness, characterized by responsiveness, self-awareness, and orientation to person, place, and time. Higher brain functions include learning, memory, and reasoning. They occur within the cerebral cortex and involve multiple brain regions connected by a network of axons. It involves both conscious and subconscious processing of information. As the central nervous system develops, some neurons expand their number of connections, providing the increased number of synaptic junctions required for increasingly complex reflex activities and processing. A person's ability to carry out higher order brain functions is a direct result of the level of nervous system maturation. Electroencephalogram is a diagnostic test where electrodes are attached to the head to record the electrical activity of the brain. It is used to investigate sleep disorders, lesions, and to determine if the individual is in a coma or a persistent vegetative state. It is also used to evaluate seizures. It measures and plots 4 types of brainwaves. Sleep is the natural, temporary absence of consciousness from which a person can be aroused by normal stimulation. Cortical activity is depressed during sleep, but functions continue in the vital centers within the brain. Sleep may be subdivided into 2 main types: REM, which is rapid eye movement sleep, which is characterized by rapid eye movements and vivid dreaming. Brain activity during REM sleep resembles wakefulness, but the body's muscles are paralyzed except for eye muscles and those involved in breathing and circulation. Non-REM sleep is a deeper stage of sleep where there's little to no rapid eye movement. It is divided into several stages ranging from light to deep sleep. During REM sleep is when we have our most memorable dreams. Cognition is a mental process such as awareness, knowledge, memory, perception, and thinking. The association areas of the cerebrum are responsible for cognition, encompassing the processing and integration of information between sensory input and motor output. Memory is a versatile element of the human cognition involving different lengths of time and storage capacities. Storing and retrieving information necessitates higher order brain functions. Sensory memory occurs when important associations are formed based on sensory input from the environment. Short-term memory is typically characterized by limited capacity of brief duration, where long-term memory can persist for limitless periods of time. The limbic system interprets the expression of our emotions, but ultimately it is controlled by the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex decides the appropriate way to display our feelings. It is an essential aspect of emotion and also relies on an intact functional amygdaloid body and hippocampus. Damage to these structures or artificial stimulation can lead to either deadened or exaggerated expressions of aggravation, affection, anger, fear, love, pain, pleasure, or sexuality. Language involves higher order processes such as reading, writing, speaking, and understanding words. Wernicke's area is responsible for interpreting what we read or hear and for producing understandable speech. Motor speech area regulates the precise motor activities required for speech production. There are several speech disorders that can affect the interpretation, processing, and execution of language.